I'm cautious to admit that I am a fan of a Netflix show that's been on for quite some time. It's called The Walking Dead. It's a show about the great apocalypse and zombies walking the earth, and it's pretty bizarre, but I fashioned watching the show like driving on the Queen E and an accident rubbernecking. And you know you shouldn't be rubbernecking, but you just can't help yourself. And that's sort of what happened with me with this show. It sort of popped into my head this week. I had watched an episode earlier in the week, and two of the main characters, Rick Grimes, the sheriff who leads a band of survivors through this zombie-infested landscape, and Herschel, who is this older man who functions as something of a father figure and mentor to Rick. They are discussing the horrors of this post-apocalyptic world when Herschel affirms that he still believes that there is a plan to all of this, that God has something in mind. Rick is, on the other hand, not downright just skeptical. He's at least not convinced. So the tie to this week's reading about the Transfiguration. Throughout the course of this show, the whole essence of this group of survivors is to make meaning of their reality. That is, they are trying to find purpose and value. They're trying to find a sense of worth. It's just this. I am amazed about the human condition, that is, the human capacity to draw meaning from almost any and all circumstances. What drives our desire to find meaning, I think, is that meaning provides for us some stability. It offers us the assurance that the world is intelligible, it is orderly, and it has value. Apart from this, the world seems not simply meaningless or chaotic, but often very hostile. And so we are born, as David Lose calls them, meaning makers, always seeming to lay some imaginative order on the various events and circumstances of our lives. Often by fitting those events into larger and a meaningful plan, kind of forcing it to make it make sense for us. Sometimes this inclination that we have to make meaning is incredibly helpful, as when we see critical transitions in our lives, whether positive or negative, as an invitation to grasp new possibilities. So perhaps, for instance, the ending of a significant relationship opens up to the possibility of a new experience. The loss of a particular part of our career may open us up to a new direction that we may have never had anticipated. Challenges that emerge that we never expected, and sometimes feel hopelessly lost and embedded in that place. That doors are opening, and we've all heard the expression, when one door closes, God opens another for us. In other words, what matters to us, and that these things help us move forward along life's journey with value and purpose, sense of community and place. Sometimes, however, this desire to find meaning is not helpful at all, particularly when we impose our meaning on someone else's circumstances or struggles. The single biggest example I can offer for that is the plight of our Indigenous peoples in Canada over the last centuries. How we, as white settlers, imposed our set of values and principles and what we thought were giving meaning to another group other than ourselves that creates such tragedy, and where our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Canada are still dealing with the intergenerational trauma that our imposition of creating this meaning for another has put on them. Or the Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted the systemic discrimination of people of color, where whites have been for decades and centuries, and Black people in North America imposing their perverted values upon another visible minority. In a more personal and kind of local example of this, I distinctly remember many years ago as a young boy when I lost my father passed away, and a well-meaning Anglican priest came into our home and said to me that, "Michael, you are now the man of the family because God needed your father in heaven more than he needed him here on earth." Or each of us has probably cringed when we've heard the story of a parishioner who may have lost a child only to be told by another so-called well-meaning person that God needed another angel in heaven. This kind of meaning making can feel like an escape, or worse, like making someone who is already suffering pay for another person's desire for meaning, order, and stability. All of which brings us to this reading today, the Transfiguration. Because if there's any scene short of the crucifixion that for me defies easy interpretation and serves to rock the world of those who witnessed it, it's this one. So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain with him. And there, Jesus is changed. He's, quote, transfigured dramatically before their very eyes. And the storyteller, Mark, seems to struggle to find any kind of vocabulary to do justice to what is happening. Jesus' clothes, he reports, became dazzling white, adding, quote, like no one on earth could make them. It's as if Mark's saying, no, you don't understand. It's whiter than white, it's more dazzling than dazzling, like nothing you've ever seen. And if this isn't enough, Jesus is then joined by two other figures from the past, that is Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah representing the law and the prophets, and in this sense, the heart and the essence of Israel's history. So what do you do with a moment like this? What does Peter do with a moment like this? Peter doesn't know what to do. And so Peter, completely transformed by this moment, he wants to hang on to it. The Moses and Elijah, as a cue for this event for him, he decides that in order to preserve it for all, he says, I will build them booths. I will build them booths. I will create a box for this event. Peter, you see, has taken this momentous encounter with God, God's prophets, and fitted it into his own assumptions and value proposition, trying to make meaning of this otherwise inexplicable and somewhat terrifying event. Peter doesn't want it to end. Yet by doing so, Peter becomes perilously close to missing an encounter with God, for just as he stops speaking, almost interrupting him, in fact, a voice from heaven both announces and commands, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Peter wants to fit what is happening into a plan. God invites him instead to experience the wonder and the mystery of Jesus. Just let it be. And I wonder how often we do the same. We often, I know I have often, desperately want an encounter with God. Some sense that we are not alone. To be assured that there is something more than what we can see and touch. And yet, in those very moments that God draws near, we find ourselves afraid or unsure, uncertain, feeling very suddenly out of control. So we try to domesticate our experience, to build a booth, to put it in a box, to fit the holy into our own plan. Why? I suspect that as much as we want to encounter an encounter with God, we simultaneously, we fear the presence of God because we fear being changed or being, quote, transformed. You've heard the expression, be careful what you pray for. What we have, that is what we have, who we are, may not be everything we want, but at least we know it. We are used to who we are, our circumstances, and have built a relatively orderly life around it. And so when God comes, perhaps not in a transfiguration kind of way, as Mark describes, but in the ordinary hopes and encounters, the tragedies of our everyday life, when God comes and unsettles the orderly lives we've constructed, we try to put those disruptive experiences back into line by cramming them into a plan. But maybe, just maybe there is no plan. Maybe there's only love, God's love for us. And maybe all God wants for us is to experience that love and share that love. And maybe it isn't necessary to fit our experience, let alone everyone else's, into some kind of divine plan, but rather to create space to experience the wonder and mystery of God. Not a safe space necessarily, because how could any experience of God be safe? But a space into which we will accompany them. Not by building booths to make it neat and tidy, nor abandoning them, but standing together in the mystery of God and God's love. In the words of the poem, we turned from the hilltop, the cloud shadowed the sun, the panorama disappeared, the hilltop was but a brief glimpse of joyous beauty. And that joyous beauty, the love of God, the mystery of God, and the encounter with God is what we celebrate today. Thanks be to God. So what I would like to do now, I'd like to offer you a survey regarding the transfiguration and transformation in our activity of God in our lives. And I'm going to ask David now if he would put up the surveys, and I invite you to read these and consider them. So the first question, how transformational has God been in your life? Scale 1, not at all, up to 5, extremely. So I'd like. Second question, have you had a transfiguration moment in your life when you have a clearer meaning who Jesus is for you? Okay. I'll end the poll now. So what we have on the first one is the answer is 2% have not, 8% for, say, maybe, a little. 43% of you, probably. 31 and 43 and 16% of you, extremely, on the first poll. Have you had a transfiguration moment? 20% of you have said you have had one. 45% of you think you have. And 35% of you say yes, definitely. That's extraordinarily interesting. Sometimes in these events, when we feel the presence of God, I often say to people, it is in hindsight that we most clearly understand how God is engaged with us, or how we have changed because of God's urging and nudging, that we look back and when we come to the forks in a road, that in those moments that God was most clearly visible, but only in hindsight. And it's sometimes we all wish that it would be more God would be more clearer to us. But I don't think that's the way God engages with us. So that's very interesting, and that's very encouraging. And I appreciate you being very candid and sharing your thoughts with us today. So thank you.